Alright, welcome back to my videography series. I'm JD, episode 6, my video game obsession. So in today's episode, I thought I'd dive into the origins of my number one hobby, which has been in literally all of my other videography episodes, from its humble beginnings and as it followed me through my formative years into adulthood. So feel free to follow me on this journey. Admittedly, this is the crux of my existence, and as thus will make this an incredibly long video. It all started as far back as I could remember, back when I was 3 or 4 years old. The console was the Atari 2600. My father played Asteroids in our basement. I had nothing better to do than watch him. He sat in front of the system for hours at a time. In addition, in the rare times that my father was not playing, my older brother took the reins. My older brother loved Defender and Pitfall. My dad sometimes played Pitfall also. So I was constantly exposed to this form of entertainment. So when I was 5, or maybe even as early as 4, I started playing it myself. My game of choice was adventure. I had always been set in my ways, so I rarely played anything else at that time. As I got older, I started trying others. We had a pretty extensive library of Atari games, maybe 50 or 60 carts in total. I have always been incredibly polarized, and when I found something with which I held a modicum of interest, it consumed me. When I was 6, my family got our first PC. Most people these days couldn't even imagine a life before computers were widespread, but I lived in a transitional time. While my older brother mostly monopolized the PC, I was allowed to peruse the system. Well, I mostly just used the software, and I loved the storyboard application. There were a few games that I got involved with at that time. Early PC games. Lode Runner was an ardent endeavor, even though I was bad at it. Hey, I was 6. I also played Demon's Forge, the earliest adventure game I know. Styx was a cool game, as was Moonbugs. I still enjoy these games even today. So many followed, including the entire Sierra library, of which King's Quest and Space Quest were some personal favorites. The Williamses and the two guys were quite the storytellers, so I continued that for a few years. When I was 7, on Christmas I got my Nintendo. I was super excited. A lot of my classmates were already heavily versed in these kinds of games, so I was feeling a bit behind the curve. Even before I got my Nintendo, I had played games like Zelda, Metroid, and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! At first, I was happy to get whatever games my parents bought, but soon I started picking them out myself. So this became my new obsession. Early on, I played some easy games like Super Mario, Joust, and Marble Madness, a game I beat more than 500 times. But some of my favorite games of that time were Mega Man 3 and Wizards and Warriors. Those games had such interesting music, and I think that further kindled my interest in them. My younger brother also received a Nintendo, but hadn't played it much, and I ended up with all his games, including DuckTales, among others. I was an ardent fan of the Disney afternoon cartoons, so games like DuckTales and Chip and Dale's Rescue Rangers were right up my alley. Between 1987 and 1988, my mother sent my older brother and I on grocery runs at the nearby supermarket. But on the way to the supermarket, we often stopped off at a video game arcade. I mentioned this in my last video as well. I often just played Rampage there. Sadly, after 1988, the arcade was converted to a deli. My parents were highly intent on making my younger brother and I into video game junkies. I was easily corrupted, but my younger brother wanted no part of it. So, seeing as he was not interested in Nintendo, he was given a Sega Genesis in 1989. He rejected that as well, and I ended up playing it, though our library for that system was incredibly limited. I enjoyed The Lion King and Toy Story, and later on, Echo the Tides of Time became my favorite game of that system. In 1990, in order to break up the monotony of back and forth travel to visit my father, my younger brother and I received Nintendo Game Boys. My parents still hadn't learned their lesson. My younger brother was not to be corrupted into this lifestyle. I, on the other hand, made this my constant companion. I went everywhere with it. Every family function therewith devolved into an episode of Super Mario Land or Alleyway. On Christmas of 1991, I got the Super Nintendo, a system that I cherish even still. It might be noted that I actually worship Nintendo and Shigeru Miyamoto, though at that time I still thought that Nintendo was an American product, naive that I was. I still hold a great deal of respect and admiration for Mr. Miyamoto, one of the greatest game designers in history. The SNES was my greatest treasure in life. I had an extensive library for the system, and continued playing it far into the next millennium. But one game truly stood above all the others. That was Final Fantasy IV, or Final Fantasy II as it was called in the US. It was a game so masterfully designed that I instantly fell in love. I had devoted myself to RPGs ever since. In my opinion, there is no greater video game designer than Mr. Hironobu Sakaguchi. He left me intrigued by the worlds he created and the stories he told. I have naught but the greatest admiration and respect for Mr. Sakaguchi, and perhaps as much love as a Western guy could give a Japanese man. Not only that, the music of that game rivaled anything I had heard up to that time and beyond. 5 of my top 10 favorite songs of all time are from the Final Fantasy series. I believe Mr. Nobuo Uematsu is the greatest composer and musician of all time. I had bought all the Final Fantasy soundtracks and was honored to have attended a concert of his music in my later life. I received Final Fantasy VI, 3 in the United States, 2 years later, and Chrono Trigger a year after that. I was truly a fan of Squaresoft. I played SNES until about 1996 or 1997. For a while after that, I got back into computer gaming with games such as Command and Conquer and Sid Meier's Civilization. In 1998, at the height of the video game wars, I was given a choice: Sega, Nintendo, or Sony. Of course, my devotion lies with Nintendo. I was shocked when Squaresoft betrayed Nintendo and joined Sony, creating a rift between me and my beloved gaming company. Was my decision warranted? Perhaps, though I can honestly say my library of N64 cartridges was sadly lacking. Although it did rekindle some nostalgia. Lode Runner 3D and Duke Nukem Zero Hour. This was a particularly influential system in my life, as it came in a dark time. But I'll talk more about that in a future video. GoldenEye 007 was a game I could play with others. Also around this time, ROMs came into being. So now I was able to play those games I never had the chance to play before, and even enjoy some older favorites. I thoroughly enjoyed Bahamut Lagoon and Mystic Ark. Furthermore, my university had a game arcade center, so I spent most of my time and money there as well, playing Soul Calibur and Tekken 4. A few years later, my father bought a PlayStation 2, so I got involved with that whenever I visited him. I frequently played Prince of Persia: The Sands of Time, Soul Calibur 2, and Midnight Club 2. After I graduated from my university, I bought a Sega Saturn game at an online auction for an anime I loved, Utena. So I bought the Sega Saturn system soon thereafter. It was another system I enjoyed passionately, with such wonderful games as Panzer Dragoon, Genso Suikoden, and Lunar: Silver Star Story. I might add that these games I played entirely in their original Japanese, so voice acting was not a problem. In 2007, I met the love of my life, my soulmate, Natasha, who rekindled in me my love of Final Fantasy. I had bought Final Fantasy VII for the PC, the Eidos version, and then Final Fantasy 8, 9, and 12 for the PlayStation 2. My father had bought Final Fantasy X2 for obvious reasons. He stopped playing PlayStation 2, so he gave it to me. Often, I traded off between playing Sega Saturn and PlayStation 2. I also played some computer games: Missile Command, Pac-Man Adventures in Time, Samurai Showdown 2, Lord of the Rings, Battle for Middle-earth, and many others. But my favorite computer game of that time was Queen of Heart 99 2nd Edition. So I was a bit behind in my games. But I wasn't earning much money, so that by 2011, I couldn't afford them anymore. Although I still played a lot of the older games, especially Super Nintendo and even Atari. I did play some social media games like Restaurant City in 2012. I bought a smartphone in 2010, but it wasn't until I moved to China in 2014 when I started getting involved in mobile games. My first mobile game was Crossy Road, which I still play fairly frequently. It wasn't until I moved to Japan in 2017 that I got my first PSP, which was my second handheld game system, and several games for that system as well. I still play Dissidia infrequently. My video gaming has slowed down progressively from 2012 onward. so that nowadays I have mostly shied away from it, though I still enjoy it from time to time. Work has kept me pretty busy, but I still return to those old RPGs, especially now during quarantine. And there you have it, my lifelong obsession. This video is long, but it shows my progression through this lifestyle and how it shaped me to be who I am. Was it good or bad? You decide. That's all I have for this week. Catch ya next time.